So tonight we're talking about apocryphal books, or books that did not make it into the New Testament. I'll just hold these up again and mention them briefly. The Apocrypha is from the Old Testament. We haven't really talked about that yet. But books like the Missing Gospels, Lost Scriptures, books that did not make it into the New Testament, the many Gospels of Jesus, the Bible's cutting room floor, the Holy Scriptures missing from your Bible. I would put that in quotation marks. The lost books of the Bible, and one we'll be talking about for sure tonight. This is the Secret Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945. The books the church suppressed, the other Bible. Last week we talked about the canon of the New Testament, and Gord, do you remember what that means? What did the canon of the New Testament refer to? Somebody help him? Jim?
Would that be the books that were adopted as valid scriptures to be used?
Yeah, that's a good definition. So, no pressure on you, Gord. What we're going to get into tonight, I hope. Now, here's my big problem tonight. I have enough material here to go for 4 weeks. And I know most of you will not be interested in going for 4 weeks on the topic, so I'm going to have to skip all kinds of stuff. And I've organized this in a way, and I'm going to be watching you, especially Bob, when I notice his head start to go. And okay, let's move on, but we'll see how it goes. I was hearing in my head someone saying, what's the use of studying books that didn't make it into the Bible? Let's just forget about them. Why bother with them? But it's part of the whole story, and it helps us appreciate what did make it into the Bible, to understand what didn't make it into the Bible. What did they say? When were they written? And why were they rejected? So on the question of why even bother with what we're going to do tonight, and maybe next week as well, is there any value in studying these books? And here's what I came up with, and somebody else might come up with another possibility too. So number one is to avoid heresy. Many of the books that didn't make it in are heretical, and that means they teach false teaching contrary to what we do have in the Bible. The interesting thing about heresy is there's nothing new under the sun. The heresies that existed 2,000 years ago, they're still here now. And so studying some of these things will help you recognize, oh, I just heard that on TV yesterday. Hopefully there's value in that. Yeah.
Do you have a definition of heresy?
Tell us what it is.
Well, it comes from the Greek word to pick and choose. So a heresy is a doctrine or a teaching that's built on just certain verses or chapters of Scripture or sayings that the writer feels are much more important than they've been given importance in the past.
Very good. And I'm going to be giving a little, very shortly from now, my definition, I call it my easy to understand definition of heresy. And I think Al will agree with me when I explain. I should have actually made a diagram for Tim to project. So the second thing, first, avoid heresy. Second thing, understand that much of what appears on TV shows and in books is utter nonsense. You will recognize after tonight. Robert talked about that, and that is utter nonsense. And thirdly, what is written in many of these books can contribute to an understanding of the historical background of early Christianity. It applies. These books are written in the same background as many of the New Testament books. The fourth thing is they help us realize that people then were just like people now. And I've quoted that, I think it's the National Enquirer motto. I want to know. I mentioned how in the New Testament we hear Jesus is born, boom, he's 12 years old in the temple, boom, he's 30 years old, getting baptized by John the Baptist. There's serious gaps. I want to know. And If I don't know, I'll make it up. And so we'll read some of that stuff tonight. And the same applies to theology. Now, if I can't find my favorite theology in the Bible, I'll write my own book. Call it the Gospel of Robert. And then people will read my theology there. And then lastly, I hope, and I had a chat with Steve along this line, this Steve over here, Steve, not that Steve over there. I hope it helps us appreciate the books that are in the New Testament and the great wisdom that our forefathers showed in carefully selecting books that are inspired by God and useful for building us up and teaching us. And they, in their wisdom, they didn't do it quickly. As we saw, it took over 300 years, but they decided, no, these books aren't really going to help you all that much. These ones will. Yes?
But the New Testament talks about there was so much to contain, was it not going to write all of it?
That's a valid point. Some of the people that wrote, for example, the infancy Gospels would say, well, there's all this other information. The tricky part on some of the stuff I'll be mentioning is some of it might be true. We don't know. And so I'll discuss some of that as we go along. But thank you for that point. These books that didn't make it tend to be referred to as apocryphal books. That is a Greek word, and it means hidden or secret, which is interesting. Or concealed is another way. We're going to look at books that were rejected for a number of reasons. Here's the 4 general categories why books got kicked out or not accepted. The books I'm going to talk about fit into these categories. Books that have orthodox theology and are profitable to read, but they just weren't considered divinely inspired, and so therefore they weren't put in the New Testament. They're good books, and I'm going to be talking about some of them later. We can learn a lot from them. They just didn't make it into the New Testament. Number 2, books that were rejected because they basically contain fake news is something we hear today. It's fake news. It's an utter forgery. Somebody just made it up, and it's more for entertainment than for education.
Are you going to talk about how they came to those decisions? How did they know they were made up?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that. It'll become pretty obvious, I think.
Okay.
Many of these stories that we'll see, they take maybe some details that might be true or correct, and then they embellish them. The Apostle Peter performed some miracles. Let's invent some more. Oh, he's traveling with a talking dog and a talking leopard now. They're preaching the gospel. That sort of thing. Yes, he performed miracles, but we feel the need to embellish them, multiply them, and so on. A lot of these books, it's unprovable, and so they will tell elaborate stories about visits to hell and to heaven and what happened between the crucifixion and the resurrection, where Jesus goes to Hades on a visit. It's mentioned in the New Testament, but it's only mentioned in a few sentences. I want to know more. Therefore, I'll write all sorts of elaborate things of what happened in the 3 days while Jesus is dead. He was busy, but the New Testament chose not to tell us all he was busy at doing. Number 3, books that were rejected basically for lying about who the author is. As I mentioned last week, I write a book and I realize written by Robert Bailey is not going to mean anything. So in order to increase sales, I say written by Steve Sweetman. Suddenly I've got a blockbuster on my hands. That's what they would do. You don't write in your own name. You say the Apostle Peter wrote this book, or the Apostle Paul wrote this book, etc. These are known as pseudepigraphical books, is the technical term for that. If they realize, this book says it was written by the Apostle Paul. It was written in AD 400. Paul died in 65. Paul probably didn't write this book. So we reject it because the writer is a liar. And then the last thing is, as we've already mentioned, books that were rejected for teaching heresy, and there's lots of those. Now my simple definition of heresy. Imagine all of doctrine is three circles. In the middle, or we'll use a sphere, in the middle are the essentials of Christian theology, things that are absolutely essential. If you don't believe this, you're not a Christian, or you're not a Christian church. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus was crucified. Things like that. And then outside that, there's another circle of things that are important, but maybe not essential. And so this could apply to when you get baptized, what words do you say? Is it by immersion, or is it by maybe pouring some water over your head? Or in a church, should we have a board of directors, or should we have some deacons and elders, etc.? And then outside of that, there's another circle of things that are mere preferences. Should we have chairs like this, or should we have wooden pews? Should we start the service at 11, or should we start it at 10, etc.? We could say, who cares? But many people do care. And so where you get into heresy, in my belief, is two ways. Number one, we add things to the core. And so we say meeting on Saturday is absolutely essential to the gospel. That's very important. Or we say, well, you can imagine. I don't want to go too far off on this. Throughout history, there have been a multitude of things that have been put into the central core, saying a priest must wear a white gown, stand at the front of the church in a thing up in the air called a pulpit. That's essential to the gospel. There's one thing. The other thing that you can do is remove things from the core. I heard that the head of the United Church of Canada said he didn't believe there was a God. Is this true? Yeah. And so that would be taking something out of the core, saying there is no God, but we're still a church. Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. Those are things where you've either added something to the core, making something that should be minor, making it major, or you've taken something that should be major and you've made it minor or non-existent. So that's very simple to understand. The problem, of course, is what belongs in the core. For me, I believe I should find these things in the Bible. And so that's why it's important to know the Bible, to understand what is emphasized as being essential and should be in the core. There are other groups that had or have other sources of authority than the Bible. So they would say, it doesn't matter whether it's in the Bible or not, we have other sources. For example, we'll say the Book of Mormon. It's not in the Bible, but it's in the Book of Mormon, therefore that's essential. That sort of thing. Yes?
When I was with 100 Hunting Street, David Maines pointed out that God follows his own word. And it's mentioned both in the Old Testament and the New Testament that everything be established in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. So he said, if you want to be safe as to what you believe, check and see, check the cross-references, and check to see if the same idea, the same teaching is in the Old Testament, in the Gospels, and in the Epistle. If you have those 3, or at least you have the Gospel and the Epistle, you've got God following his own counsel, let everything be established in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses.
Yeah, and that's good. And that applies to hermeneutics, like Steve was mentioning earlier. I will mention one thing. I was in a Alpha course, and in the small groups, weird things were being said, in my opinion. So I asked the leader about this, and she said to me, your problem is that you only have one source of authority, and that's the Bible. In our group, we have two sources of authority. One is the Bible, and one is tradition, and they are equal. So we don't care whether it's in the Bible or not. If it's in our tradition, that's equal to the Bible. Let's move on from there. So you're going to see some of that stuff come into play in some of the things we're going to be talking about. I'm going to mention briefly some common heresies that were common at the time these books were written. Sometimes these books were written because, as I said, I can't find my belief in the Bible, therefore I'll write my own book, and it'll be there. Gnosticism was probably the biggest one. It was already starting in the 1st century. It comes from two Greek words, gnostikos and gnosis, which means, one means having knowledge and the other means knowledge. Rather than look at my notes to save time, I'll just briefly sum it up. It's a very elaborate philosophical / religious system that's actually quite common today as well. It's very focused on inner self, inner realization, inner knowledge. They did not think much of the material world. They certainly did not think much of the Old Testament or the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is not the Father of Jesus. It's a lesser God. They had all sorts of emanations, or they call them aeons, between us and God. They would talk about light and darkness, a very philosophical thing, and basically you look inward and find fulfillment and salvation in yourself by reaching your full potential. You see traces of this nowadays in the New Age movement, in the whole self-help, actualization, Oprah Winfrey sort of thing. You can see traces of Gnosticism there. But it was already starting in the 1st century. Some key players in Gnosticism, a guy named Valentinus, sometimes written Valentinius. He lived from 100 to 160. A lot of the books we talked about, he had great influence on those. There was a version of Gnosticism called Manichaeism, started in Iran. Its founder was named Mani, and it was very popular from the 3rd to the 7th century. He produced his own gospel, like I said, the Gospel of Mani. You can go online and read it. Very elaborate philosophy, emphasized the struggle between good and evil, spiritual, material, light and darkness. Now, interestingly, a place in Egypt called Nag Hammadi, in December 1945, somebody dug up, it was a farmer, dug up a big clay jar that had 52 books in it, written by Gnostics. And last week we talked about Anastasius, the bishop, who had 367 defined finally what the final count for the New Testament was going to be. They figure about that time, because he outlawed certain books, that these are of no value to read these books. So somebody who had those books took them, and instead of destroying them, they buried them and sealed them, and there they lay for 1600 years. And in 1945, in December, somebody found them, and suddenly they were spraying upon the world. A lot of documents that had been hinted at or quoted, suddenly, hey, now I've got the Gospel of Thomas in my hand, because it was found in that jar in 1945. Last week we talked about Marcion. One of the heresies common then was Marcionism, started by Marcion around AD 144. Marcion really liked Jesus, and he really liked Paul. He did not like the Old Testament at all, and he didn't like anybody else in the New Testament. So he created his own canon, as I mentioned last week. He got rid of all the Gospels except Luke, and he stripped that down, took out the parts he didn't like, got rid of all the letters in the New Testament except 10 letters by Paul. So he had 11 books in his canon. He wrote his own Gospel. His father was an archbishop. His father excommunicated his own son for being a heretic. Marcionism is a version of Gnosticism. The church father Tertullian, that I mentioned last week as well, he wrote a rebuttal of Marcionism. It took him 5 books long, his rebuttal of Marcionism. Montanism was considered a heresy. It's a very interesting one. It was developed sometime between 135 and 177 and is named after a prophet. His name was Montanus. He had 2 female companions who were prophetesses, sometimes referred to as the New Prophecy movement. Eventually it was labeled by the mainstream church as a heresy. But interestingly, if we went back there, we might think, gee, this looks a lot like the Pentecostal church, or the Charismatic movement, or the Toronto Revival, things that were happening. And so it's a little hard to decide. They did do some flamboyant things, and some of the church leaders were concerned that they were attracting too much attention to the church, because this is a time period when the church was still being persecuted by Rome. This is in the 2nd century. Women could hold positions in church leadership, they believed. They called for a reliance on the spontaneity of the Holy Spirit and a more conservative personal ethic. Interestingly, Tertullian, the church father, in general supported what they said. One thing they're accused of, whether it's true or not, they felt that if I suddenly prophesy right now, what I say right now is more important than what's in the Bible. And if it disagrees with what's in the Bible, what I say right now supersedes what's in the Bible. So if they did indeed believe that, then I would disagree with that. Adoptionism shows up. This is, Jesus was not born as the Son of God. Jesus did not pre-exist as part of the Trinity. The virgin birth doesn't matter. The incarnation doesn't matter. But when Jesus got baptized by John the Baptist, this is probably where it happened. God adopted him as his son. And at that moment, he became deity or divine. It's called adoptionism. Some taught that it happened when he was resurrected or when he ascended, but in that time period, most would say when he was baptized. Then he became the Son of God. If you don't find that in the New Testament, no problem. I'll write a book that you can then read, and it'll teach that. Another big one, it's related to Gnosticism, is Docetism. They believed that Jesus was God, but they didn't believe that Jesus was human. If this was Jesus sitting here, yes, it looks like God has a body, but the word docetism in Greek means it seems. He doesn't really have a body, it just seems like he has a body. It's an illusion. So in their mind, they could understand Jesus as God, but they couldn't comprehend Jesus being human. And so that was declared to be a heresy as well. And then the last one I'm going to mention that will show up in some of the books is Nestorianism. It's named after a guy named Nestorius who lived from 386 to 450. They believed, or he and his followers believed, again, if I look at Jesus over here, there's actually 2 beings, 2 separate beings, 2 people living inside one body. One of them is Jesus, and one of them is the Christ. 2 separate people living in one body. And that's what Nestorians believe. And so that will show up. Now, by medieval times, the number of heresies greatly multiplied, but that's beyond our time period, so we're not going to get into it. Basically, part of what's happening is, if Jesus doesn't happen to say what I think he should say in the New Testament, in the Gospels, I'll write my own book and put my words in his mouth, and there now he's saying it. Yes?
When these people were adding to what we know as the Bible, did they feel they were inspired, or did they just come up with their ideas?
I'm imagining they felt inspired. And they were able to inspire others, because some of the movements I've just mentioned had hundreds of thousands of followers, and they lasted for hundreds of years, and some of them still exist today. So it's kind of interesting. I just wanted to mention one little concern with putting words into the mouth of Jesus. That still happens today in books, and so, for example, and so I'm not saying these books are wrong, but I'm saying we have to be careful. The book The Shack has sold, as of 2 years ago, over 20 million copies. That book consists of the author putting words into the mouth of Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit. Hopefully they're good words. But as soon as you do that, pay attention and be careful. A book that's very popular right now called Jesus Calling. By 2014, it has sold over 10 million copies. The author has put into the mouth of Jesus words. And so when you read the book, it's very comforting and very encouraging, because Jesus is talking right to you. And he's saying words that you like to hear. It might be a wonderful thing, but I'm just saying, be careful. Last time I mentioned that the book, The Da Vinci Code, and how basically it takes some of these books. For example, the Gospel of Thomas is one of his favorite books. I've seen documentaries on TV, anything that comes on most TV channels, I can only watch for a few minutes and then I get too angry. I think this is so stupid that I can't watch it anymore, because they will take all the books I'm going to mention, all these books that the early church rejected for various reasons, and say they're all equal, everything's equal. We have to be tolerant, right? How can you say that book's right and this book is wrong? You don't have any right to do that. So this book is equal to those books over there. And so that's where we can get into tremendous difficulties. We're going to talk a little more in depth here. The books I'm about to be talking about, some of them are available in full manuscripts. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, we have the whole thing since 1945. Up until then, it was in quotations by various church fathers. So, well, the Gospel of Thomas says this, and I disagree with that, but now we have the whole thing. Some are available in partial manuscripts. Remember, we're talking about stuff that was written 2,000 years ago. It might have fallen apart. There are others that are not even in partial manuscripts. There's fragments of manuscripts that we have. And then there are others, we have no manuscripts, but we have many quotations in these church fathers that Al was kind enough to explain to us last week. And so you can reconstruct all sorts of things by quotes by these early church fathers who were very prolific writers. I've got 40 pages of notes here, which I know there's no way I'm going to get through tonight. And so in order to get it down to only 40 pages, a lot of the books that are in the last category, I kicked them out. I read about them, I studied them, and I decided, no, I'm not going to take up the space. So even doing that, I still got too much. Most of these were originally written in Greek, but many of them were translated into other languages. In some cases, the original Greek is not available, but we have it in another language. Some of these were extremely popular books and were translated into numerous languages because I want to know. I have organized these into the following categories. Books that are similar to the Gospels, similar to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in their style or what they are claiming to present. Books that are similar to the book of Acts. There's many of them. We have one book of Acts. Why don't we have the Acts of Bob? Why don't we have the Acts of Gord? Why don't we have the Acts of Steve? I want to know. And so we have every person mentioned in the New Testament pretty well. We've got a book. The Acts of Jim. We've got it. And then epistles. And so Paul wrote epistles or letters, and so did James and John, etc. If you want to get your point across board, you write an epistle. You don't put your name on it. Say the epistle. Philip, that guy who met the Ethiopian in the chariot, he didn't write a book. We'll use his name. The epistle of Philip. And so you write that. We've got that. And then Apocalypse is similar to the book of Revelation. We got all kinds of those. Because who can disagree? If you say, I've been to hell, and this is what I saw. Or I've been to heaven, and this is what I saw. That can still happen today. But let's start with the infancy Gospels. So as I said, we hear the story of how Jesus was born. Next thing he's 12 years old and going to the temple. That's a 12-year gap. We want to know. The infancy Gospel of Thomas is claiming to be written by Thomas. It was written around AD 150, about 100 years after Thomas died. So that tells you something right there. The first time it's mentioned is by Irenaeus.
I've heard mostly Irenaeus.
Irenaeus, yeah. In AD 185, he mentions this book. He doesn't think much of it. So it's pseudepigraphical. It's not written by Thomas. Early church fathers regarded it as a heretical work of fiction, but it tells us stuff like the young Jesus had a very bad temper. When he's 1 year old, he curses and kills another child. He later kills another child who offended him in some way. When that child's parents complain to the parents of Jesus, he strikes them blind. If he's in a good mood, then he heals a man who cut his foot with an axe. A child who was up on the roof playing fell down and was killed. Jesus raises him from the dead. He makes some birds out of clay. They turn into live birds and fly away. His brother gets bit by a poisonous snake. He heals his brother. 2 other people die. Jesus raises them from the dead. Now this is when he's under 12 years old. There's some dried fish from the market. They're now live fish. They swim away. There's 1 grain of wheat. A whole meal appears. His careless father, the carpenter, like Bob, is making a bed, and he cuts the board too short. He stretches the board out to make it the proper length. Those are some of the stories we want to know. They're probably all utter nonsense and lies. But that's a very popular book. The Infancy Gospel of James is claiming that Apostle James, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, wrote this book. It was written somewhere between AD 150 and 200. So we'll say about 150 years after James died. So that means it's pseudepigraphical. It's an extremely popular book. We have it in 150 manuscripts from way back then. It was translated into at least 9 languages in addition to the original Greek, and it's long. It's 24 chapters long. It's a big book. So it's got all kinds of stuff in there. The first mention we have of it is by the church father Origen in the early 200s, who condemns it as a forgery. And it tells the story about the birth and the upbringing of Mary. It says that Mary married Joseph when she was 12 years old, which might be true. Probably was true. Probably 12, 13. Girls would have got married back then. It asserts the Roman Catholic doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. It says that Joseph was much older than Mary, and that the brothers and sisters of Jesus that are mentioned in the New Testament are not the brothers and sisters of Jesus. They're half brothers and sisters, because Joseph had been married before and had these children. And so that's where they came from. It says that Jesus was born in a cave, and it says that Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was killed during what's referred to as the massacre of the innocents by King Herod. It could be possible that Jesus was born in a cave. It could be possible that Joseph had children with another wife prior to Mary. In general, it's considered to be a forgery and untrue, but an extremely popular forgery. The Syriac, it goes by three names: the Syriac Infancy Gospel, the Arabic Infancy Gospel, or the Armenian Infancy Gospel. It was written in the 5th or the 6th century, but the first time we hear about it is in the 9th century. And it includes all sorts of wonderful stories about Jesus when he was a baby and before he was 12. When he was just a little tiny baby, we'll say a week old, he's giving theological lectures from his cradle stool. So that's a wonderful thing. And interestingly, that story is quoted in the Muslim Quran. And so this book was popular enough that even Muhammad heard this story and he put it in the Quran. This is a little gross, but if it works, it works. You get a used diaper from Jesus, and that thing will perform miracles. If I touch you with that used diaper, you'll be healed. The baby Jesus has the ability, you bring him some fabric, and it doesn't matter what color or dye, he can turn that fabric into any color. He heals a person who has leprosy. And interestingly, the baby Jesus meets the baby Judas of Iscariot. Also, the baby Jesus meets the baby thieves who are going to be crucified with him later on. And so there's all stories about their adventures. Probably most of it's lies, but very popular lies. Let's go to other gospel style. So I'm leaving the infancy gospels now. We're going to general gospel books that are either teaching some form of heresy, they're a platform for heresy, or they're lying about who wrote them. And the first one I'm going to talk about, if you explore this at all, the most popular one right now is the Gospel of Thomas. There's a whole book about it. The Gospel of Thomas is actually not very long. And by the way, all everything I say tonight, you can look it up online. So if you want to read the history of Joseph the Carpenter, which I'm skipping, just go online and you can read it. It's there. Or if you want to read the Gospel of Fake Matthew or Pseudo Matthew, just go online. You can read it right there. And the same with the Gospel of Thomas is there. This was written, it's actually quite early, somewhere between the late 1st century and the early 2nd century, though something maybe later into the 3rd century. Probably written originally in Syriac, and then from there translated into Coptic and Greek. It's pseudepigraphical in that it's extremely unlikely that Thomas wrote this book. The manuscript that we have that was discovered in 1945 in that clay jar was written in AD 340 on parchment, and it's written in Coptic, which is an Egyptian language. Since then, 3 other Greek manuscripts have been discovered that were actually older. They might not actually be the Gospel of Thomas, but they ended up in the Gospel of Thomas because they go back as far as AD 130. And interestingly, I've read the book. I've read it a couple times, the Gospel of Thomas. There is no story, there's no narrative, it's just sayings. And there's 114 sayings that are put in the mouth of Jesus. Now, it's interesting, there's no mention of the crucifixion. There's no mention of the resurrection. There's no mention that Jesus is the Messiah. There's no mention about any apocalyptic eschatology, end time type stuff, which Jesus liked to talk about in the genuine Gospels. However, out of the 114, 83 of them are paralleled in the canonical Gospels. 31 of the sayings are unique. They are not found in the canonical Gospels. The oldest surviving written references to the Gospel of Thomas are found in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome in around 222 to 235 AD. Origen of Alexandria mentions it in 233. They both say it's heresy. Eusebius, who I mentioned last week, in the early 300s, includes it in a list of books that he believed to be spurious and, quote, the fictions of heretics. Cyril of Jerusalem, writing in the 4th century, condemned it as heresy. And he thought it had been produced by a follower of Manichaeism, which is a form of Gnosticism. And so currently in our modern world there is no Christian group, thank you, that believes that this book belongs in the canon. You may have heard this book referred to. This is the favorite book of Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code, because they take some things from here and do a little spring with it. Jesus married Mary Magdalene and they had children. That's a bit of a step to get there, but Mary Magdalene does play a major part. And there's jealousy and rivalry between Peter and Mary is mentioned in here. So that's good for a story. Some of you might have heard of a Bible scholar named N.T. Wright. It's a lengthy quote, but I'll read what he says about it. Thomas makes an acronistic mistake, meaning something from the present being put into the past before it existed, by turning Jesus, the Jewish prophet, into a Hellenistic cynic philosopher. Thomas's implicit story has to do with a figure who imparts a secret, hidden wisdom to those close to him so that they can perceive a new truth and be saved by it. The Thomas Christians are told the truth about their divine origins and given the secret passwords that will prove effective in the return journey to their heavenly home. This is obviously the non-historical story of Gnosticism. It is simply the case that on good historical grounds, it is far more likely that the book represents a radical translation and indeed a subversion of first century Christianity into a quite different sort of religion than that it represents the original, of which the longer Gospels are distortions. Thomas reflects a symbolic universe and a worldview which are radically different from those of early Judaism and Christianity. So the implication, and that's what this Elaine Pagels believes, this is the true gospel. And this is more important and came before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's a Karen King who has a book who believes the same thing. The Gospel of Barnabas. Barnabas is a good name in the New Testament. Why not use it? In fact, it's such a good name. Later on, there's also the Acts of Barnabas, and there's the Epistle of Barnabas. Obviously, it claims to have been written by the Barnabas that is mentioned as Paul's companion. It was written in the late 16th or the early 17th century. Let that sink in. So it was written about 300 or 400 years ago, rather than 2,000 years ago. The first time it's mentioned anywhere is in 1634. There's two manuscripts. There were, one in Spanish and one in Italian, but the Spanish one has been lost. It's a very long book. It's longer than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John combined. And it has 222 chapters, and it's about 500 pages long. It's written by a Muslim, and it's written to make the stories of Jesus conform to the Quran. And today it's very often quoted by Muslims when they talk about Jesus. And so it disagrees with a lot of what we would read in the New Testament. Instead of Jesus promising that the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, will come, he promises that Muhammad will come. Jesus is not the Son of God. Jesus is a prophet, which it says in the Quran. I've read the Quran. And the Quran talks a lot about Jesus. The ministry of Jesus applies only to the nation of Israel and was never intended to go anywhere beyond the borders of Israel. Certainly not to Canada. Jesus did not die by crucifixion. It was Judas Iscariot who was crucified. The doctrine of the Trinity is not true. The Apostle Paul was, quote, deceived by Satan because he taught that Jesus was the Son of God. He taught that men did not need to be circumcised, and he allowed Christians to eat unclean meat such as pork. So he was obviously deceived by Satan. There are 9 levels in heaven. And it teaches a form of universalism that's popular today, that everybody will get a second chance to accept Jesus after you die. It doesn't matter so much whether you accept Jesus before you die. You will get a second chance later. And I've encountered this quite commonly. I've read books within the last year that advocate that. Any man who is not circumcised cannot enter heaven. Interestingly, the Jesus in this gospel does disagree with the Quran on 2 points. He allows you to drink wine, and of all things he encourages monogamy rather than polygamy. So he's different than the Quran on those 2 points. John the Baptist says in our Gospels that he is not worthy to untie, we'll say, the shoelaces of Jesus. But in this Gospel, Jesus says that quote. He says, Jesus says, I'm not worthy to untie the shoes of Muhammad. Jesus says in this Gospel, I am not the Messiah, Muhammad is the Messiah. Which interestingly, the Quran itself does not say that Muhammad is the Messiah. And the Quran says that Jesus is the Messiah. In this Gospel, Jesus says, I am not the Son of God. And Jesus says the promise that was promised to Abraham and the Messiah will not come through the line of Isaac, but through the line of Ishmael, which is where the Arabic nations came from. One article that I read about this Gospel, this 11 chronological and historical mistakes that indicate the book could not have been written in the first century, as it claims it was written in the first century. And as I said, it was written in the late 16th or early 17th century. The Gospel of Judas has been very popular recently. It was written in the late 2nd century, claims to have been written by Judas. It was written in Greek, probably. Irenaeus mentions it in his book Against Heresies, which he wrote in 180 AD, and he rejects it as fictitious and heretical. It teaches Gnosticism. A lot of these books are in the form of a dialogue. There's no action or stories or anything. It's a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. The writer can put into the mouth of Jesus the words as he's teaching to his disciples. The only existing manuscript we have is from the late 3rd century or the early 4th century, and it's written in Coptic. And it was discovered in the 1970s and was first published in 2006. Originally the manuscript had 62 pages, but today some of those have been lost, so we only have 26 pages. It's thought that probably someone found this and they took one page out at a time and sold them. And so they're out there someplace and may eventually be discovered. It wasn't stored very well, and today it's in about 1,000 pieces that scholars have to try to put together. But in contrast to the canonical Gospels, the Gospels we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, make Judas seem like a bad guy who betrayed Jesus. But this Judas is a good guy. He was just following orders from Jesus. He was the only one of all the disciples that understood Jesus and what he really wanted to do. So he's a poor, misunderstood guy. This gospel condemns the practice of taking communion as compared to cannibalism. The Gospel of Bartholomew, he was one of the original apostles. Let's use his name. This was written in about AD 200, claims to be written by the Apostle Bartholomew, and it appears to have been added to and modified over about the next 400 years. Jerome, the guy who translated the Latin Vulgate, he mentions it in about AD 400. We have manuscripts in Greek, Latin, and Slavonic. And the apostles in this gospel are taught by 3 different teachers. Jesus teaches them about his descent into Hades between the crucifixion and the resurrection. We want to know what happened. Gospel of Bartholomew will tell you. Mary, the mother of Jesus, does some teaching. The apostles ask Jesus to show them Satan. He does. They're all struck dead. And then Jesus has to bring them all back to life. And then Satan does some teaching and teaches them all about himself. Jesus tells them that the secret information in the Gospel of Bartholomew is this for the select. You shouldn't share this with anybody and everybody, only the elite. And that's key Gnosticism there, that it's only the elite who have the secret information. The Gospel of Nicodemus, that's a good name. And it is sometimes called the Acts of Pilate. And it's interesting, there's all sorts of writings. Christians want Pontius Pilate to become a Christian. It happens. This is an interesting one. It's written about AD 350, written in Greek, but manuscripts exist of translations in Latin, Syriac, Aramaic, Armenian, Coptic, which means is very popular, widespread. People want to know. Chapters 1 to 11 deal with the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. It's interesting, some of the people are given names. These might be the true names, we don't know. The soldier who thrust the spear into the side of Jesus while he was on the cross, his name is Longinus. Could be true. The thieves on either side, they're given names. One is called Demas and the other is called Gestus. Could be true. Chapters 12 to 26, and plus there's an appendix after that. Again, favorite theme. What happened between the crucifixion and the resurrection? We've got 14 chapters. All sorts of stories of what happened in that time period. And that, at the end, there's an appendix. It claims to be an official report from Pontius Pilate to the Emperor Claudius, describing the crucifixion and the resurrection. This Gospel of Nicodemus also developed over the centuries, and so once you get to the late 14th century, there's another little story added in there. Remember when Jesus was carrying the cross and he stumbled, a woman helped him and gave him a cloth really to wipe his face. When he wiped his face, a picture of Jesus miraculously appears on that cloth. And so that's after the 14th century. That story is included in the Gospel of Nicodemus. That cloth is later used to heal the Roman Emperor Tiberius from some disease. The Gospel of Basilides. He has Gnostic and Docetic tendencies. He was a teacher in Alexandria from about AD 125 to 150. And so this gospel was written then. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote at least 24 other books other than this gospel. He was later condemned as a heretic. The Docetus, your body only seems to be a body. Jesus did not die on the cross. He taught, remember when Jesus stumbled and he was too weak to carry the cross, they grabbed a guy out of the crowd named Simon of Cyrene. He carried the cross. And guess what? He's the guy who gets crucified. It's not Jesus who gets crucified. Jesus magically switches bodies. They crucify the body that they thought belonged to Jesus, but that's now Simon of Cyrene in that body. And Jesus is in Simon's body over here, and it says he's laughing at the whole scene. He thinks it's so funny. And so this gospel was first mentioned by Origen of Alexandria in about, who lived from 185 to 254. and he rejects it as being heresy. The Gospel of the Lots of Mary is a fascinating little book. Little because it's only 3 inches high. And apparently these were made, I don't know what it's called, but I remember when I was in public school, and girls still do this. It's a little thing that you fold out of paper and you say, Bob, what's your favorite color? And you say, B-L-E-U-E. What's your favorite number? So, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you do another thing. And then you can basically tell your fortune or whatever it is. Does anyone know what do you end up with? Yeah, you can figure out who you're going to marry or whatever it is. Does anyone know how that thing works? Yeah, they're still around today because I've seen my great nieces doing it. Anyway, this is kind of like that. We only have today one Coptic manuscript. That's an Egyptian language. It's from the 5th or 6th century. It's 3 inches high, so you can carry it around. It's like Christians do this today. Lord, what should I do? Open the Bible. Jesus hung himself. Open the Bible. Go thou and do likewise. This is where Christians basically are trying to get divine direction, and so you just open the Bible and point your finger there, and that's what God's speaking to you. This book was designed for that purpose. It has 37 pages, and so when it says the Gospel of the Lots of Mary, is referring to drawing lots. You can pick a straw, and the one with the shortest straw gets it. And in the book of Acts, that's how they chose the new apostle to replace Judas. And so this is a book of sayings or oracles. You just flip the book open and you put your finger on a page, and it will have a saying or oracle that is vague enough that you can probably apply it to just about anything. But these little books were popular to give you divine guidance. You just pick a page and read it and figure out, oh yeah, that applies to me, Al, I can see that. And so, yeah, I better marry Peggy. Yeah, it's like a fortune cookie. It's like a fortune cookie, basically. Here's the Gospel of Peter. Peter didn't write a gospel, but it claims to be written by Peter. It was written in the first half of the 2nd century, so about 100 years after Jesus was dead. We have a partial manuscript from the 8th or the 9th century. It was discovered in a tomb in Egypt in 1886. And one of the key features of this is it exonerates Pontius Pilate from all responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus. It was not Pilate's fault. It was Herod and those Jews who did it. And so that's one of the main points. It also espouses the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. Interestingly, the resurrection and the ascension happen on the same day. There's no 40-day gap. He gets resurrected, boom, he goes straight to heaven. Around AD 200, it's condemned as heresy for Docetism. I'm just going to read you some titles. The Gospel of Mary, we'll skip. The Secret Book of James, we'll skip. The Book of the Rooster, we'll skip. Pistis Sophia, which means faith, wisdom, we'll skip. The Gospel of Marcion, we'll skip. The Second Treatise of the Great Seth, we will skip. There used to be a guy who worked at the local grocery store who told me he was a Sethian. And this is a popular thing. A lot of people like, he's the third son of Adam and Eve. His name is Seth. And there's a whole thing that exists today, followers of Seth. The secret or the mystic Gospel of Mark that implies that Jesus was a homosexual. The Gospel of Truth, we'll skip. The Resurrection of Jesus Christ, written by Bartholomew, we'll skip. The Gospel of Philip, we'll skip. The Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, we'll skip. The letter of Peter to Philip, we'll skip. The Gospel of the birth of Mary, we'll skip. The Gospel of the Savior, the dialogue of the Savior, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of Matthias. There were several Gospels that had a very strong Jewish emphasis. The Gospel of the Nazarenes was one. The Gospel of the Hebrews was one. They didn't make it in. The Gospel of the Ebionites was another. And then there were all kinds of books that are similar to the book of Acts. And I will mention one that is based on historical fact. What does the word passion mean when it's referred to, talking about the passion of Jesus Christ?
The suffering.
The suffering is related to the death and suffering. And so this is the passion of Perpetua, Felicitas, and their companions. Very popular book. We have Greek and Latin manuscripts. This event that it describes happened in 203. Perpetua is a noble woman. Her slave is named Felicitas. And a group of their friends are in jail. They're waiting to be executed for being Christians. We have the names of some of the others who are in jail with them. Some of these are free people, some are slaves. At that time, about half the population were slaves. Satyrus, Revocatus, Saturninus, and Secundulus are some of them. This happens in Carthage in North Africa. It's a Roman province. And to celebrate the Emperor Septimius Severus, his birthday, we're going to kill some people in the arena. And so thousands of people come out to watch. Perpetua is 22 years old. She has a nursing baby. All she has to do is deny Jesus, they'll let her out. Her father comes to her, he's not a believer, he comes to her 4 times and pleads with her, for my sake, for your mother's sake, for your baby's sake, deny Jesus, and they'll let you go. She refuses. Felicitas is her slave. She's pregnant. She's hoping she's going to have the baby before the date of their execution, because she doesn't want to have to die by herself. And Rome had a rule, we don't execute pregnant women. Fortunately, in quotation marks, she has a baby while she's in jail, which means she can now be executed with her friends. Perpetua keeps a diary. This book is her diary of what happened. Then an editor has gone back and edited and sort of told the story before and what happened afterwards. An interesting thing is how close the friendship between the slave and the noblewoman, and they choose to die together. I'm not going to get into it. Well, they do this. The Anglican Church of Canada, every March 7th, honors these 2 women. If you look up in your book of alternative services on March 7th, you'll learn about them. At least 3 books have been written about them, and 5 movies have been made about them. And so it's not in the New Testament. This one is true. This happened. Maybe I should stop there. And so let me give you a preview of what's coming up. We'll talk a little more about some of these acts. There's just, some of them are like romance novels, like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the woman who loved him. The Acts of Thomas is very interesting. I read Rabbi Zechariah talk about that. And to this day, there's churches in India called the Church of Thomas. It's a denomination. And so this tells the story of the Apostle Thomas going to India to preach. And so there's elements of history in there. The Acts of Philip, the Acts of the Martyrs, the martyrdom of Polycarp, the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Thaddeus, the Ascents of James, the Acts of John, the Acts of Pilate. Again, Christians want this guy to become a believer, and so that's going to be interesting. The Acts of Peter and Paul, the Acts of Peter and the 12, etc. There's a bunch of those. And then we'll talk about some of the epistle style books that are in the form of letters. the third letter of Corinthians. We have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Why not have 3rd Corinthians? It doesn't exist. We'll write it. The epistle to the Laodiceans is mentioned by Paul. If we don't have it, no problem. We'll write it. The hymn of the pearl is an interesting one. Mormons really like that one. It's not in the New Testament. The epistle written by Titus, not the epistle to Titus, etc., etc. Then we'll talk about some of the books that are similar to the book of Revelation. The Apocalypse of Peter. We have the Apocalypse of John. Why not the Apocalypse of Peter? Very interesting stuff. Scary stuff. Get a tour of hell. All the different sections of hell for different types of sinners with specialized punishment that relates to your sin. Very interesting. There's a whole section for people who don't attend church.
Depends on the definition of church.
Well, what they're talking about, don't attend the building on Sunday morning. There's another tour of hell in the Apocalypse of the Theotokos. Different types of sinners, including the clerical sinners. They've got their own section. All the priests that are in hell, they got their own section with their own special type of punishment. The Apocalypse of James, the secret book of John, the Apocalypse of Paul, another Apocalypse of Peter, the Apocalypse of James, and then I'm going to talk about some non-canonical but orthodox documents that are actually quite valuable for learning about things back then. I'm going to talk about the Didache, which was the teaching. It was included in a lot of lists of the canon for the New Testament. It almost made it in. And if you find some older versions, manuscripts of the New Testament, it is in. But after 367, it wasn't. I've read that a number of times. It's got very interesting stuff. Talks about baptism, fasting, prayer, communion, church organization. The first epistle of Clement, very interesting. The shepherd of Hermas is in some of the early gospel or New Testament manuscripts. It was in some of the lists of the canon, but it got eliminated by 367. And that's similar to the book of Revelation. And the Epistle of Barnabas, which might have been written by the actual Barnabas, we're not sure. It's an Orthodox document. Okay, questions, comments? Oh, I wanted to say, remember we were talking about my definition of heresy. There's the essentials, and then there's some important things, and then there's some things that aren't so important. Some people think Augustine said this, but he didn't. In essentials, unity. In doubtful matters, liberty. In all things, charity or love. I think that's a good motto. It's actually written by an Archbishop, Marco Antonio de Dominus, in 1617. Said that, and somehow Augustine got the credit for it. And so what that says, there are some important things. We must have unity on those things. That if you don't believe this, you're not a Christian. It's that simple. Then there's this way around that, exactly how you do communion, how often you do it, stuff like that. Well, it's important, but there's liberty in that. You do it your way once a week. You do it your way once a month. We're going to still be there. And then in things, in all of these things, we're going to love each other. Questions, comments?
Just to refresh, all of these documents that you refer to, are those documents that were considered by the group that made the canon, and then rejected?
They would have been aware of them. Many of them were very popular, as I mentioned, and so they would have been copied thousands of times, and some of them were popular for hundreds of years. And so that's how you end up with a copy of this in Greek and Coptic and Armenian, etc., because it was spread all over. Everyone wanted to know. Some groups to this day, some of the books that I mentioned are still considered canonical in little sections of the church. Like for example, in Ethiopia, they might think, well, the rest of the world doesn't think this is in the canon, but we do. This.
How about in the Quran where it talks about They say if you can kill somebody, you can have rewards, you can have sex with them.
And now with angels, I think you get 72 virgins.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's incentive to go out and kill people, I guess.
Is that the correct?
As I recall, yeah. That's the justification for it, so whether we will. Private parishes. Any other questions, comments?
How long did the people who made, when I say made the canon, I'm also saying they put the books in the Bible together, right?
Yes.
And so how long did they study and deliberate? How long did it take them?
Well, this was not, we had a meeting and we decided, this was finally decided in 367 AD. And so they thought about it for 300 years. And
From
so,
the time of Christ to...
yeah. And so last week I talked about the process. I mentioned the heretic Marcion. He had his own canon, and it consisted of 11 books. No Old Testament, no Gospel of John, no Gospel of Mark or Matthew, only a stripped down portion of Luke, etc. And so over the 300 and some years, all of these books, all the books I mentioned are circulating. In some cases, okay, there's the Gospel of Thomas, and here's the Gospel of Mark. And in some places, and for maybe a couple hundred years, they're considered equal. And gradually, they're weeded out. And so, for example, two things that weeded them out. Missionary activity. I'm going to preach in Iran, and I want to translate some of the gospel into their language. What gospel do I consider so important that I want to translate it? And so I might decide, no, not the Gospel of Thomas, I'll pick the Gospel of John. And so that gradually caused a weeding out. And then persecution was a major one. When the Roman soldiers knocking on your door, hand over all your holy scriptures or we're going to kill you. Here, you can have this one. Meanwhile, the Gospel of John, they got hidden in a hole in the basement down there by the sump pump. I'm willing to die for that one, but I'm willing to give this one up. That's how you end up. In some cases, there are no manuscripts for some of the ones. Some of the ones that I have here, there's almost none, and some of the ones I eliminated, there's none, because eventually they got weeded up to the point they don't exist anymore, other than in quotes, where Tertullian or someone else read, this is heresy.
So basically, there was not a committee that decided these books are in, these books are out. There was a process by the late 300s, clearly a general consensus, these are canonical books.
Yeah, and it again, it wasn't from up above really, it was churches decided. Okay, this is a church here, what books do we just love it. And as I mentioned, in the Roman Empire in general, under 10% of the people could read. When you went to a church service, probably for an hour, hey, there's a guy who can read. Let's give him this manuscript we've got and let's listen to him read this for an hour. And so we might read the Gospel of Matthew to us. I'm not going to read one verse, the whole book, Al. What books do we love to hear? And we just have, as those disciples Jesus appeared to on the road to Emmaus, and he said, remember how our hearts burned within us when he was talking? Certain books, when we hear them read to us in a church service, our hearts burn within us. We want those books. And so churches, over a period of several hundred years, make a collection of books that are important to them. And it just turns out, it's not these books, it's the 27 books we have in the New Testament. It's just a process of gradual elimination. Some of them hung on for longer, and then some even appeared, like the Muslim one wasn't even written until the 17th century, but we got to do something to make this Jesus story line up with the Quran, so let's write a gospel to make it happen, and then we can quote it. Other questions? Yes, John.
And not to get off topic, but was there anything similar happening with the Quran? To your knowledge, was it ever rewritten or?
Well, you know, an interesting about the Quran is a fervent Muslim would say it should not be translated. That is quite a step to translate it into any language other than Arabic. And so a true Muslim, number one, would memorize the entire Quran, which is about the length of the New Testament. The good Muslim memorizes the entire Quran, and number two, memorizes it in Arabic. I've read it. It's a very repetitive, boring book, and there's almost no action in it, and so God help me if I had to memorize it. I don't know how I would do it.
So we could be rest assured it's pretty well aware it was written and not too much to
Yeah, it's that's my impression. Now there are different.
There are a lot of commentaries written after 200 years after the Quran. They're equal to the Quran almost. And I forget the name of those commentaries, but they're important.
Interpreting. They're interpreting the Quran.
Yeah, and very basic commentaries.
Well, the same happened with the Old Testament. We have the Jewish Talmud and Midrash, which interpret the Old Testament, and Jews hold them in very high esteem. So there are different translations of the Quran in English. There's one that's similar to the King James Version, old-fashioned English, and the one that I read recently is more modern English. Yes?
In the Bible that we know today, has anything been added or deleted from the 300? whatever year?
367, no.
No.
Nothing's been added. But now what would be an interesting question, there's lots of these books, for example, 52 books were discovered in 1945. What happens if tomorrow Bob's out digging in his backyard and he discovers a big clay pot that's sealed, and it's a legitimate letter written by the Apostle Paul? Goes through carbon dating, goes through all sorts of tests, and hey, this was written by the Apostle Paul. Would we put it in? Yes, put it in. But it had to go through some serious testing before that would happen. So God in His wisdom has, for the last 1700 years, nothing's been added. But there are, which I'll get to, I mentioned some of them, that are certainly worthy of reading. They're orthodox, they're not heretical, they're not claiming to be written by anybody weird that's been dead for 400 years. And they're just telling us this is the way they did it. The Didache, for example, is a very interesting book to read. And it was written somewhere between AD 65 and 85. And so this is what they were doing then. This is how they did baptism then. This is how they took communion then. This is how they met and what happened. And it has all kinds of instructions for itinerant apostles and prophets, church leadership, how do you judge prophecy, stuff like that. Written in the 1st century. Any questions? All right, that's it for this week.